economics is still built around the same factors of production that Adam Smith was going on about centuries ago: land, labour and capital. But what about energy? You can't have machines without energy. You can't have humans working without energy. So isn't that a bit of a problem? Fortunately, Steve Keen is working on reworking the basis of economic theory and modelling by incorporating the one crucial element that's been missed out, or at best marginalised: energy. Today on the Debunking Economics podcast. So Steve is, we believe, the first economist to properly incorporate the role of energy into economic theory. And on this, he's been working with Tim Garrett, Associate Professor at the Department of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Utah, and Matheus Grasselli, Professor of Mathematics and Statistics at McMaster University in Hamilton in Canada. And today we're going to try and get up to speed on their research. I guess a starting point, Steve, I mean, how do most economists treat energy? Do they ignore it? I mean, certainly if you look at the Cobb-Douglas model, which goes back to the 1920s, which could be seen as being a little out of date. But I mean, if we look at the two basic factors of production, labour and capital, I mean, that doesn't even consider feeding your workers or powering your machines. Capital is magically self-perpetuating, isn't it?
Oh, there's all sorts of issues in the definition of capital. And look, if you go back far enough, and I mean, my age is old enough these days, when I did my undergraduate, they would talk about factors of production in your first year macro or micro course, and it would be land, labour, enterprise and capital, four of them. Now, as time has gone on, the neoclassicals have slowly, even though they will say if you put them under stress, which is basically asking them a question, put them under stress, they'll say that we still incorporate that's implicitly in the
land.
Capital, the capital. Land is like capital. It's easy to make a new piece of land. Just, go and do and dredge what the Dutch do, what the Dutch have done. I'm sitting on a piece of newly made land, 500 years old. But it's because it's nonsense. The land has got fundamentally different aspects to it than the machinery, and also in that sense, so does enterprise.
But wouldn't they say that land energy is part of that land though? So it's a land choice, isn't it? Whether you have a coal power plant or crops for fuel or solar or wind farms, they all take up land, and the availability of that land and the ability to extract energy from it determines the price of that energy as an input, doesn't it?
They will waffle around it, but that's actually takes me back to my favorite group of economists, which is actually the Physiocrats who predate Smith. And when you see what they were talking about, coming from rural France, at that stage, France was UK had already begun an industrialization process using peat, wind power to some extent, mainly water power. And so there are manufacturing processes certainly in Scotland before the intervention of the steam engine by Watt. But at the time that Smith was working in Scotland and the Physiocrats were working in France was far more rural. And so the physiocratic idea was that all production comes from the land, all wealth comes from the land. And their argument was that the land was what they called fertile because it got, quote unquote, the free gift of nature. Now, the free gift of nature is another way to describe energy. And in fact, when you look at the linguistic history of the word energy, it was only invented by, I've forgotten who, but a English polymath in 1809. So you can actually say the free gift of energy is the physiocrats saying all wealth comes from energy. And they were right. Now, Smith jumps into the window. The beauty about working from the agriculture point of view, that's obvious that when you plant a seed and you get back a plant, one seed becomes 10,000 seeds, and on goes the process. So the object is reproducing itself, and the only thing you can say that's actually helping us out is nature's doing something for free, which is precisely the way that the physiocrats spoke about it. Now, Smith comes over and he then says, no, it's not the land that's producing this, it's the division of labor, which we are starting to see, of course, in the classic example of the pin factory that Smith gives in The Wealth of Nations. But it was much more obvious that something was coming out of manufacturing, which the physiocrats described as a sterile sector. They said they simply took whatever wealth was created courtesy of the free gift of nature in agriculture and converted it to something else. So the stylized model that's the most famous physiocratic model is the tableau économique, by Quenet back in the late 1700s, predating Smith. And in that table, he had with his idea of what was being produced in the manufacturing sector were carriages. So the corn was produced in the agricultural sector. That's where the wealth was generated. That's where the real wealth came from. Some of that corn was then used to convert into carriages, which of course you were selling to the proprietor class. So in that sense, the Physiocrats not only had it right on what the source of wealth was, which was converting energy into useful work. They also had a class division, which included the proprietors on top benefiting out of the taking care of that not surplus, but they were the main beneficiaries owning the land of the exploitation of the free gift of labour, free gift of land. And Smith gives us the idea of the labour and division of labour, and we call it the labour theory of value, and then the neoclassical response to that. We've wasted about 200 bloody years. And I'm not joking. I mean, that's when I write my magnum opus, I'm going to be calling Smith the person to lead economics astray, not the foundation of the
dam. And yet, when you look at this link between growth and energy, I mean, economists might not realize it, but I mean, certainly the international markets, investors realize it. I know you don't like that word, investors, but if you look at, if energy consumption falls, and we're seeing a fall in energy demand right now, the expectation is, isn't it, that the economy is going to weaken, that GDP is going to fall, and conversely, we're seeing all this concern over China trade talks failing. Demand for oil is falling as a result of that because it's an obvious relationship. There's less demand for stuff, less energy needed to make stuff. So the markets react to that.
Yeah, and then that's a sensible reaction. Whereas the economic theory, if you look at how the Cobb-Douglas production function, which is the way neoclassicals, the simple way they modify, they use what they call constant elasticity substitution functions as well, which are much more complicated and which can map between a fixed ratio of labour to capital to a variable one by changing exponents. But the fundamental argument is still this Cobb-Douglas production function, that you take labour and capital and combine them and you produce output. And if they try to bring energy in, then what the first neoclassicals doing this did was say, well, this labour is a factor of production, capital is a factor of production, energy is a factor of production. And we used to add, here we have L, K, and E as the arguments to the function. And the rate that we apply, which is where we work out what exponents we put on top of to these inputs to maintain the sensible concept of constant returns to scale, meaning if you double all inputs, if you double inputs, you double all outputs. So therefore there has to be a limit on the value of your exponents. And the value they'd use for energy is the proportion of the industry, the GDP, which you can source to energy. And in America, it's about 7%. What it argued effectively was 70% of change in output therefore came from from labour, 23%, I'll say 63 to 70%. Let's stick with 63%. 63% came from labour, 30% from capital, and 7% from energy. And I saw one of the few times I'll quote Larry Summers favourably is that he was having, in talking about his secular stagnation explanation for the aftermath of the financial crisis, he made a crack about how a bunch of Chicago economists, if the energy sector shut down completely, they'd be writing papers explaining, well, this can only affect most 7% of GDP. Yeah. Because if energy shut down completely, that'd be the end of the economy. So, and
if we move to automation, then you're getting rid of the labour element out of all of that. By and large.
No, they can't even do that because they relate the exponents to the share of wages and national income. So even though it's declined, it's still of the order of 60%. Right. So they're still arguing that most of the change in output comes from labour. Now, I always regard that these as something seriously wrong with these ideas. And I wasn't happy with the idea of adding energy as the third factor because it implied you could set a bomb off in a factory and that would improve output. If you add labour as an independent factor and capital as an independent factor and energy as an independent factor, then you've got a worker using his or her hands, a machine cutting pieces of metal in a very careful way, and an explosion. Didn't make any sense at all. So my simple insight was to say, well, labour without capital, labour without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. So rather than having energy as the third argument, independent, energy was an input into the other two. Very, very different forms of energy, of course, but labour takes energy and creates useful work. Machinery takes an energy and creates useful work, and the two are necessary working together but the energy is an input to both. And if the energy is zero, then the output is zero.
Right. But they have constraints, of course, don't they? So the amount of food is determined by land and, assuming the sun continues to shine, the amount of land that we're giving over to crops and food production. And I guess land, we do get to the importance of land again, because that also applies for how you use that land for the creation of energy, to power your machines.
Yeah, you can actually see land in that sense as a form of energy, and that's, or an energy recipient, an energy processor, because the land is receiving the sun, and the sun, which we don't, nobody, so far as they know, built. That is why you talk about being free energy, because you didn't pay for the actual source of the energy in the first instance.
So we get back to that, that rudimentary model of land, labor, and capital. My point earlier on, isn't land covering energy in that case?
It is, but not as explicitly. And that's why I'm saying if you've got to explicitly have it inside there. And that's what we've done. And that's my own contribution to that. The contribution so what that meant was, rather than saying labor and capital and energy are independent factors of production, which is the way it's put in a Cobb-Douglas framework, or saying that land, labor, and capital together produce output, which is the approach that post-Keynesians have used, and fundamentally see a constant relationship between labor and capital, saying labor and capital both take in energy, and the simplest way to illustrate that is to say that the energy output of labor is the number of workers times the number of calories they process times the efficiency with which that work is turned into useful work. And, pardon me, machinery, similar thing, but much greater scale.
And that, just as he starts to cough, that is the approach that's been taken in this bit of research that Steve has undertaken. And if you want to hear more about it, then you have to listen to the podcast in full, and you can do that by subscribing at debunkingeconomics.com or going to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen and becoming a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. That's it for this time. Catch you again very soon for another one. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.